Hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About It. My name is Emmanuel Jenkins. I am the Community Relations Officer for the Delaware Developmental Disabilities Council. I am super excited today. But before I tell you why we're here, make sure you ring the bell so you never miss an episode of Let's Talk About It. And if you don't follow our channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Follow. See, I said follow. Technically, I want you to subscribe. So make sure you subscribe so you always know what we got going on. Today's conversation, I am super excited. We know that the 2024 election is coming up. One of the most important elections in this country. But we can't have a president election without our state and local government elected officials. Today, I'm excited to be with Kyle Evans, Gay, candidate for Lieutenant Governor for the great state of Delaware. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.
I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, Manuel.
I am super excited to have a conversation with you and to learn more about you and your vision and your desires for the great state of Delaware. And if you are elected, what are your plans and focuses for the future, especially surrounded around those with disabilities and their families? Well, before we get into all of that and why we're here, share a little bit about yourself. Maybe one fun fact or something you want us to know about Kyle. Who is Kyle?
Well, I appreciate you asking. It's great to be able to introduce myself to those who are following the work that you're doing, and to a lot of people in Delaware who are focused on disability advocate issues and the ability for us to incorporate everyone into what we're doing in the state. And I'm also not used to being on YouTube, so this is exciting for me. I get to be on a real show. Um, I am a mom, I'm an attorney, I'm an advocate, and I'm currently a state senator who represents the 5th Senate District, which is, for those in Delaware, north of Wilmington and the Claymont area. And I've been doing this work for a couple of years now. I ran for the state Senate because I really was alarmed at what was happening at a national level. We can get into like some of the ways that we think about the national tenure and how that affects the state. But I guess for purposes today, it's really important for me also to mention that what I felt was happening in Dover wasn't necessarily prioritizing what was positive for my family, families like mine, people like my parents and your parents, and most importantly, all of the kids, like the next generation. I'm a mom of a 5 and a 7 year old, and I want to make sure that Delaware has even more to offer them than it offered me, as I have, been able to build a family, build a career, and engage in public service in this state. So, fun fact about me, I was trying to think, politicians, how fun are they? I am really excited to share that one of my favorite places to travel is Scotland, and I actually studied there for some time when I was an undergrad. And I chose it because my grandparents actually came to Delaware from Scotland, and I'm really close with my family who is still there. And so for me, it's really neat to have that part of me and the part of my family that gives me an even bigger perspective on, how we can be global citizens and what it means to invest in our local communities and our national communities. And it kind of gives a cool context for the work we do here.
Did you say Scotland?
Scotland, yeah.
Wow, wow. Wow, yeah, I think you may be the first person I thought that has like direct ties to Scotland, and I'm sure that may come up later in
Mhm.
conversation because when we talk about policy in Delaware, but policy in the other countries and how
Yeah.
things are different. So thank you. That is like one of those things that, and that's why I love questions like that because you really start to understand who a person is, and
Yeah.
that's such a unique thing to share. Thank you for sharing that. So the very first question I wanna or topic I want to discuss is accessibility.
Yeah.
Um, um, so can you share what your long-term vision is for improving accessibility for individuals with disabilities across the state, like accessibility as far as structure, as far as documents, accessibility as a whole. Like, what is your long-term vision for that?
Well, I think it's really important to also share that we know that this is always going to be a journey, right? Because as soon as we feel like we've really captured, and I'm sorry, is that noise in the background? That noise in
No,
the
no, you're
background
fine.
bothering me? Okay.
You are fine.
Um,
We are in our living room. We're not in the office. We are in our virtual living rooms. So you're good.
Perfect. But it's always going to be a journey because as soon as we feel like we have captured accessibility in a space, like for example, voting has been a really important place where we have increased accessibility. We have the accessible voting machines. I actually got to try one out at one of the conferences where you're making sure that if you have a visual impairment or if you have challenges like choosing different types of screen options that you can use your voice. And I think that's a really great spot. But then as soon as we do that, we find out that there's another piece of it that we need to do. And I'll point out that many of our voting locations have not been accessible. Sometimes they're moved and there's steps or there's physical barriers, right? So I think from my point of view, it's the how we approach accessibility. And I think for me, it's always asking the question. It's continuing to be curious. It's continuing to be to kind of seek answers and seek information from those who are experiencing all the services that we're providing. So for me, my vision for accessibility is always to continue to strive and continue to ask questions and realize that as we continue to adapt as a society and as more things become technological, as we change the way that everyone accesses services or accesses transportation, that we always have to have that question of how are we serving those with different abilities. And from my point of view, that's about incorporating a lot of people with lived experience into those conversations and not make not be not just saying we have all the bright ideas. I think it also means incorporating technology and innovation. And I love following the data, following innovative opportunities. And if you always have a mind for innovation and a mind for seeking knowledge and what's next, I think that we're going to be able to find a lot of great solutions and continue to improve on accessibility in the state.
Wonderful, wonderful. And you also touched on inclusion, which was going to be my follow up part of that first question.
Yeah.
So thank you for because I don't really think you can have accessibility without full inclusion and how to get there. So thank you for that. So the next question, what are some specific policies policies would you advocate for to ensure equal job opportunity in the workplace for individuals with disabilities? You know, October is Disability Employment Awareness Month.
Yeah.
So I got to have a question for employment. So, what would be some specific things that you would advocate for individuals with disabilities?
Yeah, and I'm glad we can talk about this, in the month of October. And from my perspective, it's just grounding the question and just how important employment is, not just the ability to earn a wage and have that independent self-sufficiency, but the community connections that come from employment, the growth, personal growth that comes from employment opportunities, and building relationships in addition to then that independence and that financial stability that we want everyone to be able to achieve. And so when you think about employment, I think about a lot of different aspects, how it can be so important for an individual. Um, I think about inclusive workplaces. I go straight to thinking about first how the state can be that inclusive workspace. So what do we, as the governor and lieutenant governor who are leading the administration, what are we specifically messaging and expecting of agencies and the executive branch in seeking those inclusive practices. Working with the Department of Human Resources to do that, because remember, the state is the largest employer in the state. So we should be leading in that space. But it also means partnering with the private sector. And so if we can, there are some employers who are doing amazing programs in this already. What are the best practices? Who's doing it right? And how can we work to expand those opportunities? I think a lot about some of the pathways in our public schools. I am in the Brandywine School District, and I've been really, really impressed by some of the work pathways that have been offered for our students here in Brandywine School District, to the extent that they were, there's, trying to figure out how we might be able to give more public facing ability, because we've got kids, for example, who are learning flower arrangements and can, be able to sell those and within the pathway, right? Like, so how can we just not only get folks the right training for accessible opportunities and for and that matches their skill set, but then how can we within that process demonstrate to them how exciting it is to continue that work and to have that community connection. So, from my perspective, I think the state should be a leader, but we have to work within our educational system, give kids opportunities, and we have to partner with our private sector and make sure that they are meeting our expectations. The only other thing I would say is, because I did mention at the top, I am an attorney. I really think our laws need to reflect our expectations. And so when it comes to discrimination and the ability to bring a claim, when it comes, we want to make sure that accommodations are not just a promise, but a reality. And so we need to make sure that that's reflected in our law. And I think our employment law is good, but I think that it's also sometimes confusing, and it's hard to necessarily know always what your rights and abilities are. So I would always be interested in looking at that and making sure that we can make the law clear and comprehensible, so you don't have to have a law degree in order to understand what your rights are.
I think that that even goes back to the first thing we talked about was accessibility.
Mm.
You know
Yeah,
one of the biggest reasons why people don't file a claim or anything for discrimination is, one, because the access to do it is not easy.
yeah,
Two, a lot of people don't understand fully what the process is to file a even accommodation in the
yeah,
workplace. The state has became a lot better with that portion of trying to make sure people understand what the process is, but even making sure that the law and the documents and the process and the procedures are done
yeah,
in plain language. But you touched on our educational
yeah.
system, so I want to kind of shift a little bit to go that route. But when we talk before we do that, when we talk about employment, I think a lot of times, we look at employment as landing a job. But
Mhm.
as you mentioned, it's so much more than just a job or the training, thinking about the social connection and the ability to be a productive member of society.
Yeah,
People with disabilities working saves the state money, saves
that's
the
right.
state a lot of money. I'm not talking a couple $100. I'm talking about like some real dollars.
Yeah,
The state better the economy, and it gives us that sense of belonging. So, but you did touch on our educational system. So what would be your plans to ensure that individuals with disabilities will see what they need in the educational system to be successful? The educational system is one of the most challenging but most important roots of not only our state but our country. Like what could we expect from Kyle and her team
yeah.
to impact what that educational inclusiveness would look like for individuals with disabilities?
Yeah, and that's an exciting question for me to answer. But real quick, as you mentioned the plain language piece, I just wanted to point out it's such a great opportunity for us to be able to um, bring plain language, like the science of plain language writing, into the work that we do. SB 309 was a bill that I was really proud to run this past year on healthcare directives. And what was really important to me is that the forms that were recommended within the legislation to be used were developed by plain language experts because you want people to understand their rights when they're looking at a piece of paper. So just because you mentioned it, I think it's really important. It helps everyone, right? Like, again, you shouldn't have to have a law degree to understand how to exercise or secure your rights. So thank you for bringing that up. But on the education piece, a couple of things that I'd like to highlight. One is early childhood education. It benefits all kids. It benefits workers, like getting moms and dads back into the workforce, especially when we have more jobs open here in Delaware than people seeking work. But particularly, early education is an amazing opportunity for early identification and early intervention. And we know, I mean, I have to tell this story. I was just at the Easter Seals probably last month, and I got to meet one of my constituents. And her daughter, she was receiving services, and her daughter was very young, and they were able, because they were able to do early intervention, were able to get her daughter just able to walk, increase her strength, and how important it was as this little baby is growing and that she is getting the exact type of assistance she needs to grow in the best way for her, right? And so, from my point of view, when we invest in early education, in particular, one thing we've done in the legislature is make sure that reimbursement for kids with different abilities are there's an increased, amount because we understand the extra assistance that's needed. So we've done additional work in making sure that kids get services, but also that they are identified early and get those early interventions, which has a trajectory changing effect. And you just have to see, I mean, you believe it, but to see it is truly, truly moving. I also think in education, we know that, again, parents aren't lawyers, right? And parents are oftentimes the primary advocate for their children's educational opportunities. And this is across the board for all parents in Delaware, oftentimes find themselves maybe not having, like me, not trained in education, right? Not trained in the law, not understanding how best or how to navigate a system that isn't always accessible, even if their kid isn't facing developmental challenges, right? So I think from my point of view, it's making sure that the IEP process and other processes that are provided for within our public education system, our special education systems as well, like making sure that those are comprehensible and that there is navigation assistance wherever possible. And because I've often talked to parents, grandparents, foster parents, and they need some assistance in understanding how to navigate it. There are some states that have provided navigators for families, right? That's an expensive investment, but I think we need to understand if we can't, if we can provide for everyone, we should look into it. If we can't, then where can we best put navigators so that kids aren't left behind? Our educators, our teachers, our paras are fantastic, and they're doing such great work. I'm so proud to have their support in this election, in my past elections, but they themselves are not specialists in special education always or in IEPs, right? And so I think we really need to make sure there's someone who understands the specific task at hand, which is this delivery of individualized services as needed for kids. And the better we are positioned to do that, I think the better outcomes we're going to see for kids. And then of course the pathways, just like we talked about, right? What part of the high school experience for children with disabilities, what part of that experience is also focused on what their next great step is and how to best prepare them for what they and their families expect after their educational experience.
Yeah, as you talk, I'm thinking, I was like, yeah, keep going, keep going. Because I
Yes.
think that the idea of, you touched on something. Parents are not certified or specialists, in the educational system. All parents want is the best education possible,
Yep.
possible for their children. Not to mention the federal law says free appropriate education for every student. Not
That's right.
some students, not that student, not they students, all students that walk through the doors of a public school.
Yeah, that's right.
Walk, roll, whatever it is. Once I'm school age eligible, I deserve, it is my right to have a free appropriate education.
That's
And
right.
I think what's missing, we got the free part, but we're still missing the appropriate.
Hmm.
How do we build that appropriate education for all students? It may not, I may not have the same, I may not have the same, I may have the same textbook, but I may not complete the same lesson the same way as everybody else. But
That's
that
right.
doesn't mean that I don't have that. I don't get access to uh to that knowledge. Uh yeah, that education is always one of those conversations because it's like we talking about employment, we talked about accessibility, but without education, we can't get to none of those different layers
Right.
to better someone, and everybody may not leave school and go work a full time job, 401k, work 40 years and
Right.
retire.
Right.
That may not be everybody's vision. Not that they can. That may just not be what they want. So I think that customizable, and I just believe the educational system has to find a way to stop separating students, and I think we did it. They did it way before I was born, but I think what happened was when they created special ed. I get that people need different things,
Hmm.
but when you slap the label special on it, it's like, oh no, separate those kids. So then
Yeah.
you lose the inclusiveness.
Yeah.
I remember going to school. Me and my brother would go into the same building. My brother would go left and I would go right. And we wouldn't see each other until we got home. But that's just one of those things where I'm like, we're so close to we're so close, but we're so far because every time we get closer, we do something to go a little bit farther back. And we're like, oh no, we can't. That's not really working. But you're
Yeah.
absolutely right. I think we're moving in the right direction. We just have a lot more work to do in the structure of our system.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think we have to acknowledge too that it's hard, right? And that our expectations have grown as we've learned more and more about inclusivity, about the ways in which individuals learn, the opportunities they have both in education and after. I mean, this is not, 1970, 1980. We have different expectations, and it's okay to say that it's hard to do, but it's through acknowledging that difficulty and the challenges that I think we find the solutions that we need. And so, you know, I agree, we need to be giving everyone inclusivity. And I would say the federal laws that you mentioned, they will go back to um, pre K and preschool as well for certain students. But the federal law also says that those students deserve a mixed environment with their peers who are the typical peers they're called, right, in the nomenclature, right? No, like any person is typical. That's that funny to me, but so we need to meet that mark too. And yeah, it's not going to be easy, but it has to be a priority.
You said it won't be easy. A lot of times, most of the time, the right thing is never the easy thing. Like,
Yeah.
and that's what makes it the right thing. That's how you know it's the right thing because it's not easy to shift the hearts and the minds of people to understand how we can move forward. My next question, I want to talk about the housing crisis.
Yeah.
This is not just a state of Delaware issue. This is a national issue. But today we want to hone in on our great state of Delaware.
Yeah.
What would be your plans for uh impacting affordable, accessible housing for those with disabilities and their families?
Yeah, I think it's good to acknowledge some of the challenges in this space, right? Some of it's zoning, right? Some of it is, covenants on, how we can, what you could do to a structure. Um, Other times a lack of not only affordable housing, but different types of housing, like potentially like a group housing situation, where even zoning is preventing us from expanding those types of housing arrangements where we want to have them, which is in community, right? And within accessible transportation, right? So, putting accessible housing far into Western Sussex might not be the best for those who then will have trouble with transportation and could be isolated. So I think that we want to make sure that we're thinking about how how and where the resources are needed. And then part of solving this crisis for people with disabilities is solving this crisis for Delawareans because everyone is suffering. And so, again, it goes back to that first question we talked about, which is as we are creating solutions or strategies, I should say, like making plans and hoping for progress in the affordable housing issue and area, who is at the table making sure that we're not just serving, first time home buyers, right? Who's at the table making sure that we are serving retirees? Who's at the table making sure that we are serving those who don't have transportation? Who's at the table making sure we're serving people with disabilities? And so we need to make sure that our solutions are going to have an aspect that works across the board. As far as those bigger solutions, density has to be on the table. We have to acknowledge that we have a low supply right now, and that if we continue to just build on open land, that we are going to really hurt one of our key industries here in Delaware, which is agriculture and agricultural preservation. It's not just a nice to have; it's part of what makes Delaware tick and make our economy go. And so we've got to be both looking at environmental protection and preservation, and that means I think we need to look at density in other areas, and that's a tough conversation to have, especially at the local level. But when we are asking for density, we need to also make sure that there are affordable types of units. And, also need to make sure that there are units that families and individuals can grow into. So, for example, a starter home. I live in North Wilmington, and a traditional, starter home, and is, a place to start your family, but then maybe you want to move into something a little bit bigger. Well, that means that that starter home is ready for the next family. So you want to have that progression of housing as well. And I think what's really interesting in this space is that um, you've got housing advocates who are concerned about lack of housing and homelessness. You've got home builders and you've got real estate professionals and you've got all of these individuals, and they've started talking about the same solutions. And to me, as a public servant, as someone whose job it is to represent the best interests of Delawareans, I need to listen when all of a sudden these disparate folks are coming together and saying, we all need a solution, and we have expertise and we can share our expertise, and here are the types of plans we think will work. I've got to listen. And so I think my first job is making sure that I am looking to the experts and understanding how I can help them be successful and what supports the government needs. Last thing I'll say is governments have always invested in housing. We do it through mortgage tax credits that we give to folks who pay a mortgage. But how can we invest in other types of housing if we want to incentivize different types of housing being built or being rehabilitated or being leveraged or used in different way, right? So for me, it's about thinking the best place to put the government efforts and supporting the ecosystem of housing, and our great private partners who are already thinking about this crisis and how they can work to solve it.
You mentioned a word that we use a lot as an expert. If I got $1 for every time we use that word, I'll be rich. But speaking of experts,
Yeah.
what would be your plans if you're elected lieutenant governor? What would be your plans to involve individuals, organizations, and policy and procedure development for you and your team and the some of the visions that you share? What would be your plan to make sure organizations and individuals that have those knowledge base that you need to build it? What are your plans to make sure that they're there?
Yeah, and I think I've demonstrated this as a senator in that my bills are never surprises, or I go through every effort to make sure that my bills are not surprises. Um, that when I'm drafting, and I am often sharing drafts with individuals, different councils. I think we saw that with 309. I mean, I have to give great credit to our legislative services office, and one of the attorneys there, Miss Wilson, who really worked with me to collect feedback from across the board when it came to medical professionals, when it came to advocates, when it came to individuals with disabilities, when it came to the state and others. So from my perspective, I have always operated with, here's my idea, here are my thoughts, here's my strategy, and asking for participation, asking for feedback, and seeking to learn. And I think you have to be inherently curious in order to do this job well, because if you are not, then you're always just going to think that you have the best solution to solve the problem. And so in the lieutenant governor's office, the job's a little different. You're not filing bills anymore, but through the behavioral health consortium that works with those who are facing mental illness and behavioral health concerns, through the opioid commission, and then through building connections with our different councils and advocacy groups that work to promote and better situations for persons with disabilities. I think that you start looking at regulations, you start looking at how the administration is handling certain aspects or changes. Just something that maybe seems as simple as the DART buses pulling back their services, right? Like how is that serving people with disabilities? Well, it's not. What possibly can we do? How can we work with those in the community who may be doing some of that transportation work already? How do we bring the experts to the table in making sure that our delivery of services is sound and that any changes are communicated and are not harming, right? Like you talked about steps back, right? We don't want to take steps back. So from my perspective, it would just be continuing that curiosity, continuing that relationship building, and I think leading with a large dose of humility about whether your ideas are the best ideas. It's really about understanding how your ideas could amplify the work of others, or whether you need to roll with someone else's great ideas, because that is the true pleasure of being a public servant, is that I get to elevate those amazing ideas that I find and learn about all throughout our Delaware community.
You touched on like we said, organizations building those
Mhm.
relationships, and I think building relationships is the secret sauce, but it's not a secret.
Right.
Like you need relationships
Yep.
to be any form of servant, whether it's public, whether it is a teacher, whether it's not, like whatever it is, you need relationships to get wherever we're trying to get to as a whole. But you know, the council's role is to educate, advocate, and inform.
Mhm.
And regardless of how this election plays out on November the 5th, I just know that you have a resource, a partner at your fingertips.
Thank you.
Our doors always open. Because that's our role. Our role is to really help policy and procedure and legislation and really the people who have the positions to create or elevate, as you mentioned, those great things that are being done. But we are here when it is just a thought, because that is the
Yeah.
best time to really work with people who who not only get it, but they get it because they live it, they work it, they
Right.
understand it. So versus building a bill, and then we get a copy of it at the final hour, and we look at it and we're like, "This is not gonna work."
Yep.
It would benefit not only the person who introduced the legislation, but it's going to benefit our state
Yeah.
because when you put it out on the floor, you're not going to have to wonder, is the DD Council, are they going to be against it? Are they going to oppose it?
Right.
Because we don't learn how to get a lot done in 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's a
Two
good
minutes is
point.
a we don't learn how to say yes or no in 2 minutes and make people think.
Yeah,
You might want to take this back and think some more. So thank you for that.
sure.
Understanding of including us from the beginning. We're almost to the end of our discussion.
Okay.
But you mentioned transportation.
Yeah.
We know that transportation is good, but we know it can be great.
Right.
And so, what would be your vision to really make it better? Talking about the public transit system. And you mentioned, sometimes, wanting idea to scale it back, but what can we do to make it better for individuals to have access to education, to employment, to friendships, to growth as people? We need transportation to do it. So, what would be your plans to improve our transit system here in the state?
Yeah, and I think that state leaders need to have both long-term big plans, right? Like you want a large vision, but also you need to have the ability to focus in on the day to day and how to make sure that services are being delivered and the state is operating to best benefit everyone, right? We shouldn't have to wait 20 years to get those benefits, right? So my big vision piece is I think that light rail and commuter rail is could be an opportunity here in Delaware. I know in my district, the new Claymont Transportation Center, named after Senator Harris McDowell, was a massive improvement, both in making Newark and Philadelphia accessible for those who live in this area, but also just showing us, we have a vision and we want to invest in rail. It might be an opportunity here for us. Right now, we are, always thinking about our bus systems, making sure that they are on time, right? Thinking about those who are accessing medical appointments and other services from the state, right? Like we don't want a person with disabilities, to not be able to access their state services because their bus was 20 minutes late, right? Like they can't control that. So we want to make sure that we have timely service. We want to make sure that our vehicles themselves are accessible, that our DART services and paratransit services are reliable, and that they have the types of schedules that make sense. Right now, one thing we talk a lot about statewide is the lack of services east west in Sussex County. And that's both an employment issue and it's a services issue, right? A lot of their medical services are on the eastern side as well. And so we want to make sure that we look at those east-west services in Sussex County, in addition to the north-south services that we see. Um, but I also think that we can and should understand how the private sector could be a part of building this. One question I had at a recent forum was, why don't we have more accessible um, Ubers or Lyfts, right? Why can't we have more of that in Delaware? And I think the answer is not that we can't have more of that in Delaware. The question is how. How do we partner with people who are building a business and entrepreneurs here in Delaware? How do we partner with them to make sure that they have an eye towards serving the whole community? And then how does the state service supplement all of that and make sure that there aren't gaps? I think the state's job is really to make sure that no one is falling through the cracks, and that we can make sure that employment, medical, education, all accessible via public transportation. That's my day to day vision. Of course, my long term vision is just thinking about how we can move people more seamlessly, more quickly, and more easily throughout our state over the next 20 to 50 years.
You mentioned Uber and Lyft, and one of the things that we really hear a lot as advocates who fight for this every day, we always hear this magic word, demand, demand. There's not enough demand.
Hmm.
And that saying is like really getting on my nerves because how would we know the demand if the people that need it are sitting home? They
Right.
got no way to tell you, okay, we want this, okay, we need this. So I think when we keep saying, oh, there's not enough demand, we won't know we don't know what the demand is, other than the people that are sitting home that have access to write on Facebook or
Hmm.
write to a newsletter or all these different places that people have access to communicate to. But what about the people sitting home that don't?
Right.
Transportation is the gateway. It's the gateway to everything else.
That's right.
So if we don't get that right, then we are doing not only us, but this entire state of disservice. And you talk like Uber and Lyft, even in Wilmington. Um, there's a good local transportation company. He's a young guy who has a transportation company. He does a lot for like DC and all these different things. But even as a Delaware native, there's no incentives for him to
Hmm.
go and get some vans or small trucks or buses or whatever it is that are accessible because people with disabilities are seen as a liability when we should be seen as an asset.
That's
Because if
right.
I have
Asset.
if I have access if I have access to your business, when I pull my money out or pull my debit card out, you can take it to the bank. Well, I don't get
That's
a
right.
different style. I don't get a different form of currency because I have a disability.
Hmm.
But if I got access, then I can better your business. This is why years ago you heard Jeff Markel say a better bottom line. The bottom line is we need access in order to enhance those businesses.
That's
But if
right.
we don't give small businesses an incentive, aka a reward
Hmm.
to do it, why would they?
And that's exactly what
They
we. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
well, go ahead, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, that's exactly how we think, thinking about housing too, right? the government, the state has been involved in making sure that we have resources for those who need it. And so the incentives you're talking about, it applies to the housing sector, it applies to the transportation sector, it applies to people who are building businesses and opportunities for themselves, like you said, opportunities, right? But also thinking about serving people with disabilities. And so it's those partnerships, it's having those conversations, and it's realizing that if the state can empower an entrepreneur to do something, then that might be a service that the state can support but not hold. And as we think about where the state should be operating, I want the state to be operating where we have the expertise and can do the best work. I also want to empower others in the community to be involved in serving in the same way that the state has been for so long.
And that's what we call leveraging. Le
Yeah.
Leveraging relationships. If we could learn how to map or map network in that section, if we could figure that out, we would be golden.
Yeah.
I think what happens in our very unique shaped state, what we do is we get something and we hold on to it.
Mhm.
Even our data, we get it, we don't want to let it go, we don't want to share it. But then we wonder why we get the same results. We are all practicing, many of us are practicing the definition of insanity. We're expecting something different, but we keep doing the same thing. And
Yeah.
then wonder why we get the same results.
And I think it's just
But
about building that ecosystem, right? So it's like making sure that the state can be such a powerful player in supporting everyone, and that we are leading the way, right? And then it's like, how do we think it's unemployment, it's the care economy, it's the ecosystem of transportation, it's the ecosystem of housing. And when you think about where these changes need to come from, where these, the willingness to come to the table, the willingness to be open and honest about successes and challenges, asking for help and building on those relationships, you really you need leadership in the administration to do that, because the administration is so much with the agencies and everything that goes on. So I think that's part of why my interest in being a part of the administration. I love being a senator, I love the work we've been able to do, but I think that if we want to look at systems, we're going to need leadership from the administration. And so I'm hopeful, very hopeful, that I can be a part of building those new networks and systems.
and that even as we talked about like transportation, medical appointments, the freedom of practice to religion, whatever it may be. All those things are fantastic. But maybe I just want to go to the store. Maybe I want to go to the movies. I don't want just transportation to a medical appointment. Maybe I want to go to the store and I don't want to ask my wife or my spouse to drive me
Yeah.
because I want to go run and grab some flowers. What I'm gonna say, honey, drive me to the store so I can find you in these flowers. Like that, like it don't add up. Like, or maybe I watch the TV one evening and the Pepsi or Coca-Cola commercial comes on. You know how they make the drink look really good. That may trigger me to say, you know what, I want a Pepsi. Let me run to the store. But then I'm like, oh, well, I can't do that. I need 24 hours to call Dart.
Yeah,
So that freedom of being able to move is on demand is crucial.
that's right.
My next question is about mental health. Mental health is important. But my question is, how will you impact mental health services statewide for individuals with disabilities and their families?
Well, I think you've identified, when you say and their families, you've identified how integral mental health is for everyone, and that we have to be prepared as a state to acknowledge both severe mental illness, but also the day to day mental health of those who are we're all amongst, right? And so I think when we think about statewide, it's oftentimes making sure services are available. And we can talk a lot about we have across this whole campaign talked about recruiting medical professionals and making sure that medical and mental health providers and behavioral health providers are available throughout our state. They're accessible, that they're not, you don't have to drive, an hour. Um, to have a community health professional. So I think investing in community health, investing in things like home visiting is a great example of how we can increase early intervention and delivery of services. Home visiting for when a family welcomes a child. And we check on mom, we check on baby, we make sure baby's meeting developmental milestones, and we make sure that mom is doing okay, and isn't necessarily flagged for, say, postpartum, um, uh, perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. That's the subject of one of the bills that we passed this session to make sure that we can expand services there. So, I think where we can get people into places where it's a safe space where we can screen appropriately, and then understanding what the referral networks look like and making sure those referral networks are not an hour away is really important. When it comes to particularly persons with disabilities and their families, I think it's acknowledging the holistic healthcare, the holistic mental health care, and kind of holistic care of the family. We oftentimes like to bucket people, and you need this service and you need that service and you need this service. And from my perspective, when we start having people focused conversations about the unique needs, and because sometimes it's mental health, sometimes it's food on the table, right? Sometimes it's transportation. I think we need to be really honest about the fact that we shouldn't be sending people 10 places in administration to get help. That if we identify they need help in a certain area, we make sure that help in other areas are streamlined where possible. So, from my perspective, the Behavioral Health Consortium can continue to be a leadership space where we understand the delivery of mental and behavioral health services across the state. But when it comes to our persons with disabilities, again, making sure that their voice is at that same table, I think will be very important.
You touched on many things there, and I think what happens is when we talk about mental health, but you mentioned food or transportation, they may be having mental health challenges because of the lack of all that. Maybe they're trying to figure out how to get to work, how to get food on the table, and if we can strengthen those services
Hmm.
and support their mental health, then that's the secret, but not a secret, that you are addressing the whole person.
Right.
And one of the things that we often hear, and as we talk about people with disabilities, calling 911 for a mental health crisis doesn't lead to services. It typically leads to
Someone is at the door.
somebody going to jail,
Right.
uh instead of instead of getting what they need. So it's sometimes it's difficult to be for a family that want to call 911 when they're in crisis, because they don't get the people that need to respond. They get somebody ready to take them to jail.
Right. And I
So
think that's part of the work that was done in this past General Assembly, work that needs to be continued, but a good first step as far as making sure that all of our police agencies across the state are credentialed and accredited. And so part of that accreditation process is is types of training, right? Required training, so that we know that our officers across the state have been exposed to trauma informed responses, have been exposed to understanding differences. But it's not just enough to put that on the shoulders of our officers who are serving a really important law enforcement function. We also need to make sure that they've got their partners in and people that they can bring in who are specifically knowledgeable, and their profession, of course, is behavioral health or mental health, or working with families, and especially with domestic situations. So I think from my perspective, it's a yes, and it's a how do we continue to provide our officers more, but also how do we pair them with individuals who can be great partners in that space.
Wonderful, wonderful. And our last topic of discussion is about long-term services,
Mm.
also known as LTSS, which includes respite care, home care, and home nursing, along with some other things, but those were the main things.
Mhm.
Uh, what would be your plan to increase those services for those with medical complex needs, meaning those with disabilities and their families that have medical complex needs? To me, all medical is complex because no one's medical is
Right.
the same. So everybody has a layer of what medical would look like. But what would be your plans to increase and improve those services in the great state of Delaware?
And I think this really goes back to that care economy. And For those who haven't heard about some of the work we've done in the childcare space, I think it's about taking those successes and applying them across the board to all the professions that care for our friends and family and neighbors, right? And for example, in the childcare space, we've been able to increase eligibility so that more individuals can get help with childcare. But even if we do that, if we don't have a workforce, then we can't provide those services. And so building out the care economy workforce is going to be really important. And it's really important to me that we're not pitting populations against each other when it comes to funding, that we aren't saying, well, this year, it's kids and childcare that gets funding, and next year it's those with complex medical needs, and next year it's home care, because at the end of the day, the structural challenges, including low pay, lack of benefits, they are affecting everyone who needs care in Delaware. And so, from my perspective, it's looking at those structural challenges, understanding what the true scope of that challenge is, and choosing a strategy, right? Is our strategy to make sure that those who are providing essential care have access to benefits for them and their families themselves? Or is our strategy to make sure that they are significantly increasing their pay so that they can choose, so that they have economic mobility and the opportunity to select maybe healthcare on the market? But we're going to have to pick some strategies and stick with them long term so that we're not sporadically funding initiatives and really just getting piecemeal solutions for individuals who are in this very important workforce. I'm really, the partnerships I've built in childcare, in the long term care facility, in the home care in the home care community, all of the things I've learned is that we're all preaching from the same choir. And so let's start working together to empower workers, and let's start working together to make sure that all patients and all kids and all Delawareans get the care they need.
And really, there's a lot of families taking on that work. Really
Yeah.
taking care of their loved one. But but that doesn't come with a 401k. It doesn't come with a
Right.
retirement plan. It doesn't come with paid vacation. It doesn't come with sick time. So
Right.
even when they're sick, they still gotta get up and take care of their loved one. What? I'm reminded of when we were, dealing with COVID. I got a disability. My wife had COVID, and she still had to get up and put me to bed, which meant that not only she got to struggle with a fever and all of that to get up, but now we're both at risk.
Right.
I'm already vulnerable, due to health concerns. But there wasn't nobody coming in. There was nobody coming in. There was nobody going out. Uh, so I think not only do we need to look at the system as a structure, but our biggest competitor for the healthcare system is McDonald's, Amazon,
Right.
Walmart. When you build a business plan, you wouldn't even think they are but they are because that's where we're losing people to.
Yeah.
Uh, Um, um, you know, they're leaving, they're leaving nursing homes and going to work at Amazon,
Yep.
because of the pay. So until we get that part right, we're always gonna have these issues. And then respite. What does respite really mean? Respite don't mean, oh, I'll come over for an hour. You can't leave, but I'll take care of your loved one.
Right.
That ain't that's not even a staycation.
It's
That is
not.
like that is
Right.
like that is like I'll be your eyes for an hour, but you need to stay here in case something go wrong.
Yeah.
Respite is like getting away, going to a hotel, getting a
Sitting by the
massage,
pool.
like sitting by the pool, reading a book or listening to a
Yeah.
book, or sitting by the pool doing nothing, or
Yep.
sitting in a car watching the sunset, or that
Yeah.
that is respite. When you can pause
It's a mental
and
health break, right? Like that's
exactly. Really being able to listen to the wind. My wife's so busy a lot of time with trying to run her own business and take care of me.
yeah.
Sometimes I wonder, does she remember what the sound of the wind sounds like? Or just that thought of sitting alone for a moment to hear the wind, feel the sun, soak in the vitamin D
Yeah.
without wondering or worrying, what needs to happen next.
Right.
So thank you so much for sharing your vision. November the 5th is right around the corner.
Right around the corner.
And I'm gonna let you get back to your race, but I want to thank you for spending time with me today. And for my uh, viewers, if you are watching, make sure you subscribe and make sure you like this video. And that way you never miss an episode. You never miss an episode of Let's Talk About It. And you can ring that bell. It's somewhere on the right or the left. I don't know. Just look for the bell. Look for the bell. It's there. Ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Kyle Evans Gay, thank you so much. Candidate for Lieutenant Governor for the state of Delaware. And good luck. Good luck on November
Thank
the
you.
5th. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Oh.